circular power window again. In fact, I'm not going to do it there because that's my corrective node. Let's create a new node, stick that in there. I'm just going to take the softness down, drop the size right down, plonk it slap bang in the middle of that sofa and hide everything else. So I'm using my highlight mode to hide everything else and bring my scopes up. And there you go. You can see that cyan. You can see the red channel down the bottom. If I look at it in my parade, it lets me visualize it in another way. So I can see green is higher, blue is slightly lower. So it's actually not quite pure cyan. So if that was a problem, I could bring towards my blues and I can lift up my blue channel just to meet the green perfectly. So it's now technically a pure cyan. Whatever color this object is meant to be, I can use my eyes. I can have maybe even color swatches, fabric swatches. I know that Nick Scali, part of their brief to Brett was to make sure that he was really accurately capturing and conveying the colors of the products, because you can't have a client seeing an advert for something and then walking in to buy it and they're not the same at all. So there's a lot of care taken in the color management for Brett's productions, and particularly for these commercials for Nick Scali, to make sure that they are as accurate as possible. So, you know, it puts a lot of emphasis on me as the colorist to kind of make sure that I'm maintaining that. And this is where the technical side of color grading is so useful, and the scopes are allowing me to clearly visualize. And it also gives me the ability to say to the client, you know, if they're worried at all, oh, that doesn't look quite right, I can say, look, you know, you may or may not be using calibrated monitors. I am, but more importantly, I'm using these scopes and I'm definitively checking these values against what I know they should be. And it just gives you that clear kind of path through to a perfect kind of finishing product, really, that you're going to deliver out the other side. You sometimes just get really stubborn, kind of persistent casts in the very deep shadows and very sort of top highlights, and you try neutralizing them, but sometimes, you know, you want a bit of roll off. Even with the log, you have a tiny bit of roll off there, because if things just suddenly go from affecting one pixel and then not the next one, you get a hard cut between the two, and that's not pleasant at all. So there's always going to be a roll off, and sometimes no matter what you do, there's just a sort of stubborn areas at the tops and bottoms. Sometimes a kind of a quick and dirty fix actually is just to take out the saturation from those areas. If you have no color in those areas, then there's no cast. So a nice thing to quickly do is to actually use your curves, and there's in DaVinci Resolve there's a curve called the Lume versus Sat curve. So it plots the shadows on the left and the highlights on the right, and anywhere you put a control point along that point, you can then raise or lower the saturation of that tonal range. So there are actual preset buttons. So if I click the shadow preset and the highlight preset, you can see it adds presets that allow me to just quickly bring down. So that's a very quick way of me bringing down the saturation in my shadows. If I bring up my waveform overlay, let's turn off the Y, so we've got the red, green, and blue. You can see in the shadows, let's just bring this up. You can see in the shadows that there's actually a lessening. You can see the RGB splitting apart as I add saturation and then blurring. And as I move this up, we can see it going further and further up. So I can actually quite effectively bring out any color casts in these darkest parts of the frame, and then I can roll them off. I can even turn on little Bezier handles to actually control that even more precisely. So I can make sure it's really just rolling up and out of those deepest shadows. And that allows the image to have all that color pulled out of those darkest areas. Is it what I want? Well, potentially. You know, it's allowing the color at the top to stay there. In this case, it doesn't really apply, but it can be a quite quick way of sort of teasing out any stubborn color casts in those areas. And like I said, you can do the same with the highlights as well, so we can bring that down. I very rarely find myself needing to do this in the highlights, because normally when I'm shooting, I'm prioritizing highlights. But shadows, this is quite common, and particularly with certain cameras, they have quite a high noise floor, quite colorful noise as well. So I know the Sonys have quite a lot of kind of magenta-y noise in the shadows on like their Alpha series of mirrorless cameras particularly. And so this can be a way of kind of getting that out without just putting too much green in the rest of the image. So there's a couple of tips there that will help you, I think, with those, persistent color casts or tricky color casts in the shadows and the highlights. There's another curve which you might also find useful, which is back in the normal curves, but again, it's similar to turning off the Y channel in the scopes. It allows me to just work with the individual red, green, and blue channels on the curve. So if you're finding that you've got too much green, for example, in your shadows, you can just bring up the green only curve. Now you have curves just like this in Final Cut Pro. You have curves just like this in a lot of tools actually, so that it allows me to pull the green to the right. It's getting less and less. If I go too far, now my image goes magenta, not what we're after. But I can actually do that. I can eyeball it, or I can look in the scopes and I can try and make sure that that's moving in the right direction. At the other end of things, if I feel like potentially there's a little bit too much blue, I've been contaminating my highlights, I can isolate the blue curve, grab the highlight there, and I can just bring that down, and I can just start to make sure that we don't have so much blue in those highlights. If I come down too far, I move towards yellow. If I go too far the other way, it looks even worse. So I can pull that around. If you want to protect bits that are further down the tonal range, I can add a control point just a little bit further down, just bring that back up. And so it's more or less now left everything alone up until there, and then it's rolling off just at the top. You can also do that. There's a number of ways to do this, as you can probably tell. So you've got a combination of the high and then the high soft and the low soft controls here, which essentially just kind of does this for you. So look at the scopes, hot scrub through these parameters, so click in the middle and drag left and right, and you will be able to see as that blue channel in this case, or green or red or Y, you can do it that way as well, will enable that kind of soft rolling off, and it does just a gentle kind of clip in that channel, which is kind of tantamount to the same thing. So there's a number of ways that you can tackle specific problems with color balance in specific ranges of tonality within the frame. One final useful way to kind of check if things are how they should be and whites are crisp, I'm going to use it in this example on the white top that the talent's wearing, and we've also got this grey sofa here, and that's just a very simple RGB picker. I'm just going to right click and just tell it to make sure that it's showing me the picker RGB value, and what that allows me to do is actually hover over an object in my image and see a readout, a direct readout of the pixel underneath the pipette of the red, green and blue values. Now those red, green and blue values are based on an 8-bit scale, regardless of whether you're using 10-bit or 12-bit or RAW or whatever. The scale that's used is a standard 8-bit scale, so each color channel has a number from 0 to 255, which represents the 256 different shades available within those 3 different color channels that you would have in an 8-bit signal, which is a bit kind of confusing potentially. It's a bit like the scopes, I don't know if you've noticed, but the scopes in DaVinci Resolve go from 0 to 1023, which is representative of the 1024 different shades that are available in a 10-bit signal. But if you're grading 8-bit footage or 12-bit footage, it doesn't change. So again, that could be potentially misleading. All you need to know is that if I'm looking for a white or a grey or a black, whatever those numbers say, they should be the same. So if I go to the side of this sofa, I can see that actually there's a pretty big shift off towards those green and blues. There's quite a lot of kind of bluiness in there. If I come to her white top, again, there's quite a major shift, and it's actually very difficult for me to see that with my eyes, but the RGB picker is actually showing me that as I move across the image. If I go to the grey over here, I'm just going to create a quick circle power window. I'm just going to drop this in. So if I drop that on top of her white top, let's just shrink that right down, hide everything else. We can see in our RGB overlay, we can see in our parade, we can see where those values lie, and we can see there is a slight dominance of green in there. So to help us pull that back out, we can just come in. So if we've got too much green, we want to go towards magenta because it's opposite it on the color wheel. So as I move towards magenta, that's going to be redistributing those, and I just want to try and get them so that they're all level, which means popping them somewhere like that. That looks much better. Now, of course, that's only working within that small circular window. If I turn the window off, that will then apply to the entire clip. And that looks really crisp and white. But with the RGB picker, we can see red 114, green 116, blue 128. Okay, so there's a tiny bit more blue, but it might just be that pixel under, get a range of different measurements and check and see, what kind of values you're getting. But if this is a white top, in reality, I know that sounds like an odd question, but it looks white, but was it white? We weren't there. I would need to check with the art department and wardrobe and make sure, was this a pure white top? Was there some kind of blue shimmer to it? It's good to know that as a colorist, but let's assume this is a proper, true white top. It's just almost there. It just looks like there's a tiny bit more blue to take away, but I can use the RGB picker to make really specific readings from objects that should be gray or white or black and really get down to it and balance it out, setting me up perfectly for the kind of continuity phase that will happen after this, and then going into my creative look at the end. I know that I've got this really solid foundation to move the whole piece in the direction it needs to go in. So those tools will allow you to kind of balance the colors in your image, and it's a great way for kind of getting that neutral primary grade. But one of the issues that you might find is a problem with our vision, actually. Well, it's not a problem, it's a function of our vision, which is simultaneous contrast. Now, in human vision, simultaneous contrast is the effect where our brain changes its perception of a color based on what colors surround it. That manifests itself as a bit of an issue sometimes in color grading, because you can, be absolutely tied to the scopes and, this says this is this, and let's draw a window around this, and now I know that this is definitely white, and all the things I've just shown you how to do. And yet still you can have a shot that just doesn't look right, and you can really struggle and just think, well, I don't understand, and like I said, it's a kind of a combination of scopes and then going off your gut when you look at a calibrated reference. And if you're looking at that reference and you don't feel right about it, but the scopes are telling you it's correct, that is almost always one of those times where you have to go with your gut, because assuming that there's nothing wrong technically with your reference monitor, and this is why you can't do this if it's uncalibrated, if your gut's telling you it doesn't look right, then probably there's an issue of simultaneous contrast going on. So in this case, it might be that her skin tones don't look right because of the cyan wall behind her. It might be that the sofa looks like it's not the right color because, in fact, this one's gray, so that's pretty easy. But if we go to, say, this orange one, we might feel like the color behind this sofa is making us think the orange is too yellow, or the orange is too, green or something. So that is one of those times where experience really helps you when you're starting out, and you can be a little bit slavish to your scopes. And I've done a spot check, and this sofa is a definitely orange sofa, and this is 100% the color that it's meant to be. It doesn't look right when I look at it on my reference monitor, but no, the scopes don't lie. And they don't lie, but your brain does, and that's the problem. Your viewers aren't going to sit there and watch this commercial with a vector scope next to it. So they're going to be looking at it with their human impaired vision or compromised vision, in the same way that you're looking at that reference monitor and questioning it. So what you need to do is actually sometimes make things look wrong technically so that they appear correct visually. And that is a bit of a random one, but it happens. And a classic example of simultaneous contrast tripping you up would be interviews where the background is a strong color and it's not playing into the hands of your subject. So I'm just going to come back to my Brett interview. There's a yellow picture in the frame. So just off his left shoulder, there is this yellow picture up on the wall. There's also something red, like a book or a picture frame or something, up on the mantelpiece there. I actually think those colours are fine. I have actually graded them just to slightly pull down their saturation, just so they're not competing too much with him, just in terms of drawing the viewer's eye. Let's say that there's a green background, or the wall behind him was entirely painted yellow rather than just a part of the frame being yellow. That could potentially make the white shirt, or the red book on the mantelpiece, or it could affect the way that those other colours appear. And we would do maybe an RGB spot check, or maybe we'd create a small circular window and check it on the scopes, and everything would be telling us that, oh no, these things are right. But because they appear wrong, we should correct them out, even though they are correct. So what you'd have to do then is you'd have to do a split screen with one of, another shot of maybe the same person or the scene where they don't have that color behind them, and then just split screen it with the one that you're trying to adjust, and then just do it visually by eye. It's one of the times where it's safe to depart from the scopes. It is now about looking at that reference panel and thinking, right, let's get these so they perceptually they appear correct, even if actually technically they're now not correct. That takes experience to kind of muster the confidence to do that, but it's something that you should plan sort of to happen, because it does happen all the time, and it's worth knowing these things so that you don't trip yourself up later on. So let's pull this all together, okay? We've now talked in detail about contrast. We've talked in detail about addressing color balance issues and tints and casts that we might not want. Let's strip one of these shots. So I'm going to go take this right back. So I'm going to create a new version and completely reset it right back to the beginning. This is the raw image, and in fact this was actually shot raw. So this is Canon Raw Light, this file. This is the raw image stripped right back. First thing I need to do, as discussed, is tackle the contrast. I am going to go straight into my curves. I'm going to make sure I've got my Luma waveform up. And I can now see what my eyes are telling me. This is compressed. It's got that log look, that flat look. I'm going to pull my blacks down. And quite fortunately here, we've got these deep shadows in the kind of deepest recess of the fireplace here. That's going to be placed just touching zero. I'm going to grab my highlights, and I've got these bright highlights. There's actually a sort of a specular highlight off the side of Brett's glasses there. That's actually the brightest thing. In this early stage, I might just place that just underneath, in this case, 1023 or 100 IRE. But in reality, I think later on, if that starts to clip, that's not a massive issue. It is a bright specular highlight. They are expected to clip in a standard dynamic range project. So that's my black and white pinned. I'm now just going to grab a point sort of roughly where his skin tones are. I'm just going to start to pull down to just place his skin maybe just about there. And then I'm going to grab just above that to start to pull this up towards that part of the range. His skin is looking relatively good. It's a bit washed out. Now this is just starting to disappear up there. Let's just pull that down a bit. Let's pull this a little bit further down. So contrast-wise, I mean, it's certainly in the right ballpark. I want that shirt to kind of ping a little bit. Let's just bring it up more like there. And now I want to push some saturation in. So again, this is where the panel, we can work quickly with the panel. So let's push the saturation in over here. Let's get my vector scope up, put it on 2x zoom, and just check that we're not doing anything crazy here. Constantly referring to scopes, so I'm checking my scopes and adjusting based on those, and I'm referencing my reference monitor and pulling that where my gut is telling me that this feels right. And color cast wise, so that's kind of contrast is placed there. You know, I've distinguished these contrast and then hue. The truth is, once you get good and quick at this, you're kind of breezing through these stages. So I'm done with contrast more or less. I'm already more or less done with color. I'm just going to take advantage of the parade just to double check that this white shirt really is white. And we can see the tops here. I reckon the red channel is just ever so slightly higher. So I'm just going to come in. I'm actually going to go into my color primary bars where you can individually access red, green, and blue bars, which just makes it much quicker to pull this down. So in my highlights, I'm just going to pull my red just down ever so slightly. They now line up. And as an initial pass, we've gone from that flat log input to broadly in the right area. That's a primary correction. You should now not be sitting back going, done. Well, maybe you will be, I don't know. If you're in a real hurry, maybe you're doing a grade that needs to go out instantly, maybe you're on set just doing light grades for dailies, yeah, fine. but this is my primary grade. It's quick because I'm experienced, because I know what I'm looking for. I'm reading the scopes. I've got the panel here, so I can work really quickly to get that right. But that's not me done. That's just me right now going from kind of, something that's clearly not ready for transmission or for delivery to something that's in the right ballpark. With further refinement, we end up with this. This is the final grade that I did on this particular image. It's made up of 2 nodes, so it's really not much work. The first node has got that kind of contrast and color, general color balance across the primary, across the whole image pushed in. And then I've just got a secondary node where I'm actually just pulling out a little bit of saturation from the yellows and reds behind him. And I'm just tweaking it slightly to kind of, allow him to kind of come forwards. There's very little to do with this image, and that's because I've taken the time in production to light it, white balance it properly, and I've chosen the shirt that he was wearing. We've orientated him within the frame to give us the lighting that we wanted. So quite quickly, I've actually got an image that I'm really happy with, going from the log to the final image. It's not creative. There is no creative requirement for this. I want it to look clean, crisp, so that when you see his interview in this training course, you're not distracted by, why is there yellows in there and why is that really crushed? And, you're just kind of taking in and watching this interview and allowing the important information that Brett's telling us to kind of absorb that and not be distracted by the color look. So all of this primary adjustment that I've done, which actually in practice probably only took about 20 seconds, is kind of moving us towards our final goal with this image. And it really pulls together, I think, the last lesson and this lesson. Get your contrast pinned, move on to your color balance, get your whites crisp and your blacks black, and get that image ready for that creative look if that's what's coming next. Or potentially that's you done because you just want a good, clean, neutral image and that's all you're after, or all your client is after. And I won't lie to you, actually probably 75, 80% of the time, that's what's required for the work that I'm delivering as a colorist. The client isn't asking me for some outlandish look. They're asking me to make it look good. They want it to look accurate and realistic. And the reason they want that is because the message, the narrative is more important than the style. And that's why there's very little work to do in the Nick Scali video, because of the color management, because of the time that's been taken to neutralize those colors and get good, crisp images coming in. It's all about accuracy and then a little bit of making the product pop. So that's where a little bit of masking, a little bit of mid-tone detail, a little bit of sharpening around the sofa. That's all that's required to really deliver this final project. And the final ads that Brett created for Nick Scali, I think, speak for themselves. They're vibrant, good contrast, lovely rich color palette, good skin tones, crisp whites, accurate grays, accurate blacks, and a little bit of sharpening on the sofas just to kind of really make them pop out. And it speaks for itself. It's a lovely finished product that the client was incredibly happy with. So I think one of the most important things to bear in mind when you're doing your primary contrast balance is you can always think of it like music. So music, we think of 2 things. We think of level and we think of EQ. I don't really know very much about audio at all, I'll be the first to admit, but I do know that a song with high levels and low levels and peaks and troughs in terms of volume has a high dynamic range. In the same way, if we have bright highlights and deep shadows, we have high dynamic range contrast. But you've also got with audio this spread of EQ, spread of frequencies. So if you've got lots of bassy kind of notes or instruments, then it's good to mix those with some sort of high trebly kind of vocals or whatever, or percussion, and it gives you a rich kind of texture in terms of EQ. It's kind of the same with contrast. If we want, like in these commercials, we want a nice spread, we want some nice bright highlights like her top in this particular scene here, and then we've got these deep shadows in the background. We're really kind of trying to create a nice textured, visually sort of rich scene, and we can move towards that with our contrast before we start our color balancing, which will come immediately afterwards. And in that color balance, we're looking for clean blacks, clean whites. Grays are actually grey. We're using the Parade, we're using the vector scope, we're using the waveform overlay, whatever it takes to kind of check those colors, and remembering to calibrate and remembering to reference that calibrated monitor, and ultimately go with your gut, because that's how your viewer is going to see the final product, and so they're going to be under the same influences of color vision. So if we can look at that and go with our gut, and we're really happy that we're fulfilling the client's brief and we're delivering something that's accurate and works well, in this case, non-stylistically, allowing the product to shine, or in a drama, it might be stylistically allowing the color to sort of convey the emotion of the scene, then you're going to win. You're going to come out the other side of this as a colorist, kind of feeling like I've ticked all those boxes and I've delivered something that's really maximized the image that I was given from the client, and you're going to get loads and loads of work, because that's all clients want. They want you to work to their brief, be a good communicator, give them an image that they look at and their viewers look at and go, yeah, that looks great. And I think Brett's done a wonderful job of achieving exactly that with these Nick Scali commercials that he's kindly let us work with for this lesson.